of what others sometimes say about the book of Romans, and I ran across a comment by a brother that has proven through the years, he is passed on now, but proved to be a genuine Bible scholar and a sound man, Brother Thomas Warren. And I appreciated what he had to say because he agrees with me. No, but what he said was, when you master the book of Romans, you have pretty well mastered the Bible. And that's not an exaggeration, because the book of Romans emphasizes what the entire theme of the Bible really is: the central personality of Christ, the plan that God has devised, how he has dealt with man, those whom he used, how he brought the salvation into it, what all it does. And the book of Romans emphasizes that, and that's what the Bible does from beginning to end. He wrote that as a comment concerning a commentary written by Brother Roy Deaver. And of course, they were, Brother Deaver, Brother Warren, were great companions. And I thought his evaluation was worth repetition because of the knowledge and the skill that Brother Warren demonstrated throughout his life. So I'm glad that he got it right. Now, as we have studied, there are things in the book of Romans that can be easily grasped, and there are things that are quite difficult, at least I think so. And the chapter that we're going into tonight, chapter 11, is among those that I think has some very difficult passages. Some of the others have had those passages too that are hard. Now, the first part of the chapter is not too hard, but here the Apostle Paul is in the context talking about what is the spiritual condition, what is the spiritual relationship between God and the Jew. Now, Paul was thrilled that the Gentiles had received the gospel. He was devastated that his own people, the Jews, the Israelites, had rejected Christ. And we have read about his great moaning over that, really, and his willingness to do anything that he could to bring them to the Lord. And he tries to show in these chapters what is the real condition, what is the relative condition between Jew and Gentile, and both of them, to God. And he discusses this in chapter 9 and chapter 10, and continues here in chapter 11. He's going to shift gears when we go to chapter 12 into another general theme. But here he says, and he is taking note of the fact that the Israelites had not received God, and therefore, of course, God was not pleased with them. I say then, hath God cast away his people? And then he says emphatically, God forbid. Now, it was not God's fault that the Jews were not pleasing to God. It was because of the Jewish rejection of what God had provided. It is true that God had made covenants and promises with Israel. But God hasn't cast Israel out. If they're cast out, it's because of their own fault. It's not because that's what God would have brought to bear. But he shows, using himself as an example, how that God has not cast out all of Israel. He said, for I am also an Israelite, the seed of Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. And then he cites something else, something that Tony just briefly skimmed over and touched on in his lesson tonight. Another instance which shows how that God has not cast away all of his people. He said, what ye not, and that means know ye not, that the scripture saith of Elias. Now, who is Elias?
Elijah.
That's Elijah. All right? How he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying. Now, keep in mind, there had been a famine in the land for 3 years. And Elijah came to God and they had this contest at Mount Carmel that brought the drought and the famine to an end. But Elijah was still, even after that great victory, quite a discouraged man because Jezebel had sought his life. He said, Lord, they have killed thy prophets. Dig down thine altars. I am left alone, and they seek my life. Now this was Elijah's response to God when he found him under a sycamore tree and later in a cave. Elijah, what are you doing here? He was way away from the scene of Israel at that time. What are you doing here? He said, Lord, I'm the only one that cares. I'm the only one left. Have you ever been in situations where you felt like, well, nobody seems to much care about this but me? Well, that's the way he felt. And he said, they seek my life. But how did the Lord respond to him? The Lord said, I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Elijah, you are not alone. There were 7,000 in the land that stood with him. Now, why those 7,000 didn't sort of let themselves be known, I don't know. But sometimes the brethren think it's expedient just to never let anybody know where you stand. But nonetheless, Elijah was not by himself. And even though God was very displeased with Ahab and Israel because of their idolatry, he is simply showing here, to show by illustration of a historical situation, God has not cast away all his people, because all of his people had not turned against God. All of the Jews had not rejected Christ, you see. He said, even so then at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. There are some who have partaken of the benefits of the grace of God. They have been elected or selected because they had met the conditions of election. Election means they were chosen. God chose certain ones to be saved. Who did he choose? Those who would obey. And he says, now there's a remnant, not a great host, but there are some who have also, even at this present time, have partaken of the benefits of the grace of God. Now, having mentioned grace, he emphasizes this whole system is dependent upon the grace of God. I think as we study these things, we have to sort of keep in mind, don't we, that all of it is built on, dependent on, and function because, primarily and in the beginning, the grace of God. If it had not been for the grace of God, nothing else would really matter. We're not saved by grace alone. It's a system of grace, however, and there are many components in this system as we are learning. But the grace of God is the system, and he says, and if by grace, then it's no more of works. When you read works in the New Testament, the writings of James and Paul and others, you have to keep in mind there are different kinds of works. There are works of the flesh that will condemn a soul. There are works of merit by which we cannot be saved, works of our own righteousness. We can never earn salvation. But when anybody does anything, that in itself is a work. Even faith is called a work, isn't it? And man is the one that is to believe. And Jesus called it, they asked him, what must we do the works of God? Jesus said, believe. That's man working. Well, that's an obedient response to what God calls upon. So there are works of evil, there are works of merit by which we can't be saved, and then there are works of obedience. Now, without the works of obedience, there can't be any salvation either. But If by grace, it is not by a meritorious system. That's what he's saying here. He's emphasized this several different times. You cannot be good enough to go to heaven. Some people take that and say, well, there's no use of being good. Oh, yes, there is a need of being good, and we'll see that a little bit later on in the book. Because there are other kind of works that are necessary, but you know, even when we do the works of obedience, we haven't earned anything. We've just done what we ought to do. He said, then it is no more of works. The law of Moses was a system of works. You had to do it perfectly to be acceptable. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then it's no more grace. Then we have a phrase that pulls a toe sack over my head. Otherwise, work is no more work. Well, what does that mean? That's when I almost, in writing my commentary, decided that it's no use. I believe I'll just close shop. Otherwise, work is no more work. If it's by grace, work is no more work. Well, if it's by grace, meritorious works won't get the job done. If it's by grace, works of obedience are absolutely necessary. So he is saying here, otherwise, and what I'm thinking, otherwise the works of obedience, they're not really works of merit. I may be adding to the scriptures here, and God forbid that I insist upon this, but this is one of those phrases, the meanings of which I don't profess to be able to explain to you, because I don't even know whether I know what it means or not. And it does help when you try to explain it to somebody to first have a grasp of it yourself. That's a very peculiar phraseology there to me. If any of you can shed some light on the meaning of that phrase, it would be helpful to all of us. We know it is by grace. We know it is not by works. If it was by works, it wouldn't be by grace. And then there's this confusing phrase that he could just as well left out.
It is God who works in us to will and to do of his good will. So God gets the credit, not us.
Well, that's true. That may have some connection with this particular phrase here. But then he asks the question, what then? Israel has not obtained that which he seeketh for. Well, what did they seek? Acceptance before God. They did not obtain that. But the election, those who are chosen, those who have obeyed and thereby selected, they have obtained it. Now that was true whether one was a Jew or a Gentile. The election obtained it, but what about the rest? Some of the Jews had obtained what they sought. But what about the rest? He says the rest were blinded. Now, look at verse 8. According as it is written, God hath given them a spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, ears that they should not hear, unto this day. Is it God's fault that they're in a spirit of slumber, dull, lethargic, blind, deaf to the call of God? God allowed it to happen. God didn't force that condition upon them. You know, God does not violate how he made man with a power of choice. We call it a free moral agent, a person that has the ability to decide what he wants to do. God doesn't infringe upon that. He lets man go whichever way man wants to go. Now, he tries to persuade man to go the right way and give him the evidence as to why he should, and entices him and motivates him by the blessings that he offers and all of that. But if a person wants to be in spiritual slumber, God let him sleep right on into hell. If a person was to close his eyes and his ears to the gospel of Christ, God said, if that's what you want, you can do that.
Is this saying that it's not a matter of this particular, or at least the person character described here? It's not that they're so evil; they're just unconcerned.
Well, that the spirit of slumber, I think, is the lethargic, indifferent, don't much care attitude. Yes, but you know, the Bible talks about God letting some. He sent some a delusion. Well, he allows them to be deceived. He doesn't make them be deceived. God will allow a person to shut his eyes to the truth, if that's what he chooses. And if he wants to be deaf to the call, okay, if that's what you choose. Now that grieves the heart of God, since he's not willing that any should perish. But he allowed that to happen, and that was the condition of many of the Jews. Paul said, unto this day. That's the way it's been. Then he uses another illustration to show the condition of the Jews. As David saith, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them. I wrestled over this too. How could this be? There's a table in my house that I dearly love. It's the dining room table. It's where I get my nourishment. It's where I feed my body. And the food sustains me. The Jews fed upon, if you please, their table was the law of Moses. That's what they looked to. That's what they advocated. That's what they said should be followed, though they were hypocritical in doing so many times. At least that was their table. But their table became a trap for them. It was a stumbling block to them. It became a payback upon them because they looked to their table rather than to what the Lord had provided. Yes, Tony?
This is off the cuff, so it's offered off the cuff. The quotation in verse 8 is from Isaiah 29 and verse 10, and there he speaks about the spirit of deep slumber, quoting it. But there he also makes mention that it's closed your eyes, namely the prophets, and covered your heads, namely the seers. In Isaiah, they were listening to the false prophets. In other words, they were feeding at the wrong table. They were eating the food of the false prophets and the false seers. And the children of Israel, many of them had listened to their current modern day thinkers, these various rabbis, and
that's what they were feeding upon.
That's what they were feeding upon.
Do you know of any way to add a comment to a book that's already been printed?
Footnote.
I think that, well, I'd have to find all the books and write it in. I think that at least their table was that upon which they fed. They were feeding at the wrong table. And as a result, it had become a trap and a snare and a hindrance to them. If they had only been feeding upon the right sort of feeding. And here he's trying to explain, isn't he, why the Jews were in the state they were in. God didn't cast them off. They were like they were because that's what they decided and chose to be and do. And that was the reason they were not saved. Look at verse 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Was it God's intent for them to stumble? Did he cause them to stumble so they would fall? Not at all. God didn't cast them away. God didn't cause them to stumble. God didn't make them fall. God forbid. He uses that phrase so often, which is an emphatic way of saying, let it not be so. No, that just cannot be tolerated, that thought. But rather through their fall. Now here's something that resulted from the fall of Israel, their rejection of Christ did something that produced a early benefit to Gentiles. He said, but rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, as we read from the Old Testament, we know from the prophets and all, it was always God's intent, even from the verbiage of the prophets that God made to Abraham, that the blessings would be to Jew and Gentile and universally to everybody. Eventually, the gospel would be taken to the Gentile, regardless of what the Jews did. But the rejection by the Jews hastened the carrying of the gospel to the Gentiles. And that, of course, was a benefit to the Gentiles. The Jews were very jealous of their law. They were provoked to this kind of jealousy of their law. They were provoked against the Gentiles, for they were jealous of Gentiles who were considered acceptable before God, and they weren't. But it was their rejection. It wasn't God's design or intent that they be the way they were. But that which they did, reject Christ, hastened the time that the gospel was taken to Gentiles. Now, point along that line, when Paul would go into a city, usually, where did he go to preach?
Synagogue.
Where?
Synagogue.
Synagogue. All right. He had preached to the Jews in the synagogue. He didn't go there to worship according to the Jewish law. He went there because he'd have it all to teach. There were people who had common convictions in many matters. And so he took advantage of that. But when the Jews rejected it, as most of them did, at least in the preaching of Paul, to whom did he go?
The Gentile.
You see how that the rejection by the Jews hastened the taking of the gospel to the Gentiles. I think that's what he is saying here. There was a benefit that came out of this sad action on the part of the Israelites. He sort of repeats that in verse 12. Now if the fall of them be riches of the world, and the diminish of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Oh, wouldn't it have been so much better if the Jews had accepted Christ? Look, their rejection has brought the gospel more quickly to others, but look what their acceptance would have meant. A whole lot more. It would have been a whole lot better, would it not? And he stresses that in the next verses. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle of the Gentiles. That's what Ananias had told him he was going to be. Magnify mine office. And if by any means I may provoke to emulation, that's imitation, them that are of my flesh, the Jews, and might save some of them. I'd do anything to get them to be saved. He said, for if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, if their rejection and being cast away because of their rejection, if that brought reconciliation for others, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? You know, I say this, Paul looked upon, at least had the hope even yet, of the conversion of the Jews generally, don't you think? At least he worked for that. He prayed for that. He hoped for that. And he says, though they have rejected it, if they would accept it, it would be like the resurrection from the dead. Now that really is something momentous, the resurrection from the dead. I think about Lazarus. I think about the widow of Nain's son and others. I think about Dorcas raising someone from the dead. I think about Eutychus who went to sleep because Tony was preaching. Raising people from the dead, a resurrect. How do you express a thing but be more glorious than the dead coming alive? And Paul says that's what it would be if the Jews would only come to Christ. It'd be like the resurrection from the dead. Now he reasons with Gentiles concerning their relationship and what they owed the Jews. The Gentiles owed the Jews something. Not all of them realized it, but they did. For if the first fruit be holy, well, who were the first fruit of the gospel? They were Jews, weren't they, on Pentecost? Now, if that be holy, the lump also is holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. Now, he's picturing here the relationship of Jew and Gentile. He starts off, here's a plant. The root, the first fruits, the branches, they're all holy. That's the way it was with the Jews who first accepted Christ. But now here's what happened. If some of the branches be broken off, and they were, some of the Jews, of course, were as branches broken off, they did not bear fruit. Thou, the Gentile, being a wild olive tree, you're not of the original plant. You're a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Some of the Jews were of the holy branch, broken off. The Gentiles were as if they were grafted in. I wish I could remember some of the comments that I heard when I taught this at East End, and some of the nursery men that were there and gave us a good teaching about what you can do about, here's a good branch, good roots, good plant, good fruit to begin with, some of the branches broken off, how you can graft in some good ones. And that's the way the Gentiles were. And they gave us a good lesson in nursery. And Paul is using this to illustrate. And here's the way it was with the Jew. Unbelief caused them to be broken off. Here's the way it was with the Gentile. Because of belief, they've been grafted in. Now notice what he says in the next verse as he continues this. To the Gentile, boast not thyself against the branches. Now you Gentiles who've accepted the gospel, don't go around bragging here how much better you are than the Jew. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root. You weren't the root. Gentiles weren't the root. The Jews were the root. But the root, thee. The root produced the thing to which they were grafted in, so they owed a lot to the root. And the root belonged to the Jews, you see. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off. Why were the branches broken off? That I might be grafted in. That's the attitude some of the Gentiles took. God kicked out these Jews so he could take us in. He said, now don't you be going around boasting like that. It was because of unbelief that they were broken off. It wasn't just to make room for you. Now, as a result, there was room for them. But that wasn't the reason they were broken off. They were broken off because they didn't believe. And thou standest, why? They did believe, by faith. So it says, be not high-minded. And so the comment, don't put your nose up in the air that you're so much better than these Jewish people. Because you have accepted the gospel and they didn't. We're so much better than you are. You know, some people got their nose stuck up in the air so high that if it rained, they would drown. And he said, now don't be like that. Don't look down on these Jews, but fear, respect for what you owe them. You know, one of the wonderful things later on we read about when Paul was collecting funds for the churches in Judea. He said, now, it's proper for you to help them in carnal things because they've helped you in spiritual things. The Jews owe a lot. The Gentiles owe a lot to the Jews. I'm a Gentile. I owe a lot to Jews. Leaving politics and all that sort of stuff out of it, I find it difficult to be prejudiced toward the Jewish race, if you want to call it that way. because my Lord was a Jew. Now, I know there were some Jewish scoundrels just like there's some Gentile scoundrels. But Jesus was a Jew. The early church was built on the Jews. The promises were made to the Jews. The plan of salvation came and was delivered through the Jews. We owe a lot to the Jews. Regardless of what they did with it, we owe a lot to the Jews. Because we have the plan of salvation that God did bring through them as He promised and prophesied that He was going to do. And how wonderful it is that we have it. But it wasn't because of my Gentile ancestry that we have it. It's because of what the Jews did that we have it. Is that exaggerating or putting too much glory upon the Jew even in their disobedience? Are not the fact that Jewish people reject Christ, but God used that nation to bless us all? And that's the point I think that he's making here. Don't be high. Yeah?
It's a perfect lesson against prejudice.
Yeah, and I don't want to stay on that too long. That can get embarrassing. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest He also not spare thee. So they didn't have anything to be boastful about so much. Then he says, two of the great contrasting, not contradictory, contrasting characteristics of God. Behold therefore the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity. But toward thee, that's the Gentiles that had accepted, goodness. If, and that was conditional, if thou continue in His goodness, otherwise thou shalt be cut off. If that doesn't put a bullet through the heart of the doctrine of once saved, always saved, there's not a Jew in Jerusalem. You can be cut off. And if you can be cut off, I know what happens in John 15 to the branches that were cut off. They were gathered and they were burned. Anybody have any comment up to this point? We're about to come down here toward the closing verses of this difficult chapter. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. Now it was because of unbelief they were broken off. Unbelief because they were unacceptable before God. That's the reason for it. But now if they change that, if they believe, why, they'd be just as welcome as they could be. They'd be grafted back in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and the Gentiles were, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Well, if God could save the Gentiles, how much easier it would be for Him to save the Jews. For the Jews had been that good olive tree to begin with. So Paul is just simply showing, yes, they have turned their back on Christ, but oh, they could believe. And only if they would. He said, I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery. Now, a mystery is not something that can't be known. It isn't known, but once it's revealed, it's known. Have any of you ever watched Perry Mason? 28-minute program. And 27 and a half minutes of that program, the guilty one could be any one of a half a dozen different people. But in the last few minutes, he explains it all. And it's not a mystery anymore. I've watched those programs when they were on, and I think he missed it several times. I think he let the guilty one go, but I didn't agree with the writers. But, you know, I like when I watch television or watch a story on television, I guess I'm different from other people. If it doesn't end the way I like, I make up my own ending. And I said, well, it's this, especially in a sad story. And when I see the cowboy riding off when he should have stayed with his family or something, I said, he's just going to get some groceries. He'll be back. I just make it end like I want it to end. But now, Paul is simply saying here, God is able to grasp the Jew back in. And for if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, and you are the wild ones, the Gentiles, well, he can certainly put the natural branches back in. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel. Notice, blindness in part. There were some that weren't blind. Paul was an example of some that weren't blind. The events with Elijah shows that there was a remnant that weren't blind. Here's a phrase that you can wrestle with too. That blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Premillennialists like to look upon this and say that all the Jews are going to get their eyes open, and they're all going to be saved miraculously when the Lord comes, and they're all going to be taken to Israel. I don't believe there's going to be room for them, but anyway, they're all going to be taken to Israel, and they're all going to be saved. Well, he discusses something over here in the next verse that shows that that's not what he's talking about. What does it mean until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in? Let me suggest to you what I think it means. There will be blindness until everybody recognizes the Gentiles are just as acceptable as the Jews. Until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. People, the Jews particularly, had to accept, could learn to accept the idea. Salvation for the Gentile as well as the Jews. They can be blind, and they would continue to be blind until they recognize that is the truth. And so all Israel shall be saved. Now in some of the modern versions they've got, and thus all Israel will be saved. Will is a very definite thing that can't be changed. Shall is a future conditional word. And the word so is an adverb. An adverb tells how. You know, nearly every word like that ends in ly is an adverb. That's one way you can always almost tell an adverb. It ends in ly. So is an adverb that tells how Israel would be saved. Not that all Israel is determined and will be saved. If they do the way God says, believe, they will be saved. And the Jew and the Gentile are going to be saved the same way. Peter made that emphatic in Acts chapter 15. You know, if Jew and Gentile are going to be saved the same way, this idea that God's going to save all the Jews miraculously when he comes again, then he would violate his own will, because that's not saving everybody the same way. He's not going to save the Gentiles that way. He's not going to save any of the Jews that way. He hasn't saved anybody since Pentecost that way. And so all Israel would be saved. How? They're going to be saved by belief, just like the others. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. That's how they're going to be saved. For this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins. They're going to be saved by forgiveness of sins, just like everybody else.
Chapter 10, verse 16, they'll have to obey the gospel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the way they're going to be saved. Paul is pleading with you. Recognize your condition, but look how you can get right. 28. As concerning the gospel, they, that's those who have rejected Christ, are enemies for your sake. We may not look upon unbelievers as enemies, but those who have the opportunity to obey the gospel and don't, they're not friends of God. They're at enmity with God. They're working the ways of the world. And they're not friends of God's people spiritually either. As touching the election, now as for the saved, they, the Jews, are beloved for the Father's sake. Jew and Gentile are loved by the Lord. You know, the Lord, though the Jews rejected his Son, he didn't cease to love them, did he? He still pled with them. He still preached the gospel to them, even do today. I've got a copy of the New Testament there at home, and it's the King James Version, but in the back they've got prophecies that show Jesus to be the Messiah. And it's an edition of the New Testament that is for Jewish consumption, to show how that these prophecies of the Old Testament point to Christ, and they should accept that. Of course, at the end, they've got a premillennial sort of a thing about it, but the Jews can still be saved. They are beloved of the Father. And here's why. For the gift and calling of God are without repentance. Now, that doesn't mean man doesn't have to repent. That means God hadn't changed his mind. God hasn't repented of what he intended and desired for the Jews as well as the Gentiles. He says in verse 34, as ye in time past have not believed God, yet ye have now obtained mercy through their unbelief. Here again we show the rejection by the Jews brought the gospel to the Gentiles. Even so have they also now not believed, that through your mercy they may obtain mercy. Paul is saying, because the Jews rejected Christ, you had the opportunity. Now that you have had opportunity, possibly your acceptance of it will provoke them to want to receive it. He's using both to try to persuade both. That's the relationship of the Jew and Gentile. Why is that so important? For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. The gospel is for all. It's a universal need. It's a universal solution. It's a universal invitation. Jew and Gentile. Now the next few verses are words of praise of this system he's been talking about, applicable to Jew, Gentile, then and now. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or hath been his counselor? Who would be so arrogant as to think that you could advise God? I think that a lot of liberals, if they'd been on Mount Sinai, they could advise God not to be so negative in the Ten Commandments. That's the way they would have handled it. But who would think that you could advise God? Or who hath first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. Paul is praising God for this marvelous system of salvation that would be both through Jew and Gentile on the same terms. I think that's what that praise is right there, don't you? He is praising and giving thanks to God for the greatness that he had. All right. Now,
in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16, Paul says, who has known the mind of the Lord, and who may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. It was revealed to the apostles.
Right.
They were simply telling what God had done.
I'm afraid there may well be in the mind of too many people today, they're instructing God. It sounds like to me sometimes people religiously are trying to convert God to man. And God, you accept that song, Just As I Am, we have to watch that, because sometimes people think God's going to accept you just as you are. He calls you just as you are. He didn't accept you just as you are. But it seems that a lot of times people get the idea, well, we'll bring God over to our side. They never seem to think that we ought to get on God's side. They are advising God. They're rewriting the ways of God. They're instructing God. And they're teaching people the ways of men rather than the ways of God. But Paul understands this system of salvation. He knows all the intricacies of it, all the details of it, all the relationships of it, all of the background of it, all of the operations of it, all of the blessings of it, and he praises it and praises God because of it. That, I think, is what he is talking about in the closing verses of chapter 11. Here, he shifts his theme somewhat, still in the system of salvation, but he points out, okay, what does this require of us who have taken advantage of this system of salvation? To my mind, chapter 12 is the most marvelous one single chapter on the theme of Christian living that we find in the New Testament. Now, that doesn't mean the others are not very useful and valuable and everything, and it's just that one, and that doesn't degrade the inspiration of what he said anywhere else. It's just that the content of chapter 12 is so abundantly overfilled, in a way, with the requirements of those who take advantage of the system of salvation. And this is really a most relevant, applicable, useful chapter into which we will embark shortly.